Starting Monday, your new president will be my son, Mark. Dad lifted his glass while applause rolled through the private dining room. I stayed seated. For 12 years, I had run operations at Bennett Industrial Supply. I had negotiated with angry vendors, rebuilt schedules when we were drowning, and stayed late enough that some nights the cleaning crew knew my dinner order. Yet Dad didn't even glance at me until the cheering died down. Then he did. "Lucy, clear your desk by Monday." The room went quiet. I stared at him. "You're firing me?" "Mark needs room to build his own team," Dad said as calmly as if he were changing office furniture. My brother walked over a few minutes later, smiling into his drink. 12 years here," he said, "and you're leaving with nothing." Nothing. That word pulled an 11-year-old memory straight out of the dark. And for the first time that night, I stopped thinking about what Dad had taken from me and remembered what he still owed me. I looked across the room. Dad was already laughing with two longtime suppliers, accepting handshakes, as if the future of Bennett Industrial had been settled in a 5-minute speech. I got up without saying a word. The restaurant shared a connected commercial complex with our offices, and my key card still worked. I crossed the quiet corridor, pushed through the glass doors, and walked into the office I had apparently been given 2 days to erase myself from. My desk was covered with evidence of the life Dad had just dismissed. Vendor notes, production schedules, expansion reports. I ignored all of it. I crouched beside the bottom drawer and unlocked it. Under old notebooks sat a faded blue file. I had carried it from office to office for more than a decade. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then I opened it. Bank transfer confirmations, old correspondence, a repayment ledger, and one signed agreement with my name beside Dad's. I hadn't read it in years. I closed the file, tucked it under my arm, and went back. Mark saw me first. Already packing. Dad turned at the sound of his voice. Then he saw what I was holding. His smile vanished. He crossed the room quickly and stopped inches from me. "You kept that?" I looked at the file, then back at him. He wasn't surprised it existed. He was scared I still had it. And suddenly, I had one question. If that file was worthless, why had my father expected it to disappear? Dad's hand closed around my elbow. "Come with me." He didn't wait for an answer. I followed him through the restaurant corridor and into his old office. Mark started after us. Dad turned sharply. "Stay outside." Mark stopped. "What?" I said, "Stay outside." That was the first moment I knew the file mattered more than Dad wanted anyone to understand. He shut the door. The smile he had worn through dinner was gone. "What are you planning to do with that?" I held the file against my chest. I wasn't planning to do anything with it. Dad's jaw tightened. "Then why bring it back?" "Because you just fired me in front of half the company. You're being dramatic. You told me to clear my desk by Monday. Mark needs freedom to build his own management team, and this has nothing to do with that." "It doesn't." I watched him carefully. "Then why are you worried I kept it?" Dad looked away. That silence took me back 11 years. Bennett Industrial had been close to collapse then. Vendors were demanding faster payment. Payroll had become a weekly crisis. Dad had called me into this same office and shut the door exactly like he had tonight. Back then, his voice had been different. "We may not make it through the quarter." I had just received the inheritance Grandma left me. Dad knew it. He asked if I would help. I transferred $180,000 into the company because I believed I was saving more than his business. I thought I was protecting our employees, our family name, and everything Dad said he had built for us. The company attorney insisted we document it. Dad signed beside me. He looked me in the eye afterward and said, "I'll never forget what you did." For a while, he made payments. Then the business recovered. Orders grew. We expanded. The payments stopped. Anytime I asked, Dad gave me the same answer. "Later, Lucy, when things settle." Years passed. I let them because he was my father. Dad stepped closer now. Decent daughters don't drag old family arrangements out because they're upset. I stared at him. Decent fathers don't use those daughters for 12 years, then fire them in front of everyone. His expression hardened. He reached for the file. I pulled it back. His hand froze in the air. That tiny movement changed something between us. Dad had always controlled the meeting, the company, the timing, the story. Not this time. Don't do this, he said. Do what? Destroy Mark's future because you're angry about losing your job. I waited. He still didn't say the one thing that would have ended the conversation. He didn't say the debt was paid. The door opened. Mark stepped inside. What the hell is going on? Dad turned. Nothing. Mark looked at the file. What's in that? Dad answered before I could. Nothing that concerns you. Mark stared at him. You just gave me the company. Dad said nothing. I closed the file. Then I pulled out my phone. Dad's eyes narrowed. Lucy. I opened the signed agreement, laid it flat on the desk, and photographed every page. What are you doing? I emailed the copies to myself. Dad lunged a step forward. Too late. The message sent. When Dad and I walked back into the dining room, Mark was right behind us. The retirement dinner was still going, but the celebration around our table had thinned into uneasy conversations. Dad tried to resume shaking hands. Mark wouldn't let him. He caught my arm near the head table. Why did Dad look terrified when he saw that junk file? Ask him. I'm asking you. And I'm not explaining something he apparently decided his new president didn't need to know. Mark's face tightened. Instead of lowering his voice, he raised it. She's threatening Dad over some ancient paperwork because she didn't get the company. Two senior managers standing nearby turned toward us. Dad heard him. He could have corrected Mark. He didn't. That decided it for me. I set the file on the table. Dad. His eyes locked on mine. I asked one question. Was the money you asked me to put into Bennett Industrial ever fully repaid? Dad didn't answer. Mark gave a short laugh. What money? I kept looking at Dad. Well, Lucy, this isn't the place. That hesitation did more damage than any accusation I could have made. Mark looked between us. What are we talking about? $5,000, 10, $180,000. His smile disappeared. What? The conversations around us stopped. Dad lowered his voice. Enough. One of our longtime managers, Alan, stepped closer. Was this during the cash crisis? Dad shot him a look. Alan continued anyway. I remember that year. We were days from missing payroll. Mark turned to me. You put $180,000 into this company. Yes. His head snapped toward Dad. Why didn't I know about this? Dad straightened his jacket. Your sister has been compensated very well over the years. My salary compensated me for working here. I said it didn't repay money the company owed me. Stop. Dad's voice carried across the table. This is a private family matter. I glanced around at the employees who had watched him dismiss me. You made my departure public. Nobody moved. 20 minutes earlier, these same people had applauded Mark's succession. Now they were watching Dad avoid every direct question. Mark reached for the file. Let me see the agreement. Dad blocked him. You don't need to see it. Mark stared at him in disbelief. You just gave me the company. How can this not concern me? Dad had no answer. I picked up the file. I'm not going to stand here pretending I know exactly what every clause means after 11 years. Let the company attorney and accountant review it. Dad's chair scraped backward. No. The word came too fast. He seemed to realize it immediately, but Mark had heard it. So had everyone else. Dad looked at me, anger finally breaking through the calm expression he had maintained all evening. That agreement was never supposed to come back into this. Silence swallowed the room. I didn't need to accuse him anymore. He had just admitted the document mattered. Mark slowly turned toward our father. The man Dad had announced as his successor no longer looked proud. He looked blindsided. What exactly did you give me tonight? By 9 the next morning, Dad had made his first move. My phone buzzed with an automated notice. My Bennett Industrial email account had been disabled. Seconds later, I tried the company system. Access denied. Monday hadn't arrived, but Dad was already erasing me. The difference was that I no longer needed his system to prove the file existed. I opened the copies I had emailed myself and found the attorney's name on the agreement. He had handled the documents 11 years earlier. When I reached him, I kept my question simple. Was this agreement ever formally discharged? There was a pause. I can't answer that from your copies alone, Lucy. I need the corporate records and the accounting history. Then check them. I will. Mark called less than an hour later. He didn't bother saying hello. Dad says you're trying to sabotage the transition because he chose me. Did he show you proof the obligation was satisfied? Silence. Mark. No. That was all I needed. By early afternoon, the accountant had begun reviewing the archived books. His preliminary finding was simple but devastating. Bennett Industrial had made repayments to me for several years. Then they stopped. A significant balance remained on the ledger, and there was no corresponding document showing I had forgiven it. I stared at the old file on my kitchen table. Now Dad's reaction at dinner made sense. This wasn't only about embarrassing him with an unpaid debt. He had planned a succession while behaving as though an unresolved company obligation simply no longer existed. My phone rang again. Dad. His tone had changed completely. I'd like to resolve this privately. Yesterday, you told me to clear my desk. I'm offering you a generous severance package. I almost laughed. What do I have to sign? Another pause. A standard release confirming that all employment and prior financial claims against the company have been settled. There it was. Yesterday, the file supposedly had nothing to do with Mark taking over. Today, Dad needed my signature to make it disappear. I'm not signing anything until the agreement is independently reviewed. You're holding the company hostage. I kept it alive when you asked me to. I'm asking whether you kept your promise. He hung up. Later that afternoon, the attorney scheduled a formal meeting before Monday's transition could proceed. Dad arrived first. Mark sat across from him. The accountant took the chair beside the attorney. I brought the old file. For the first time, Mark was allowed to read the repayment ledger himself. His finger moved down the entries, then stopped. This is the remaining balance. Nobody answered immediately. Mark turned several pages. I watched his expression change as he reached a section I barely remembered. The provisions connected to specific company assets. What does this mean? Dad suddenly reached across the table. Give me that. The attorney caught the document before Dad could pull it away. Richard. Dad froze. The attorney placed the agreement flat on the table between all four of us. Don't touch it. Then he looked directly at Dad. We need to discuss what this means for Monday. The attorney kept the agreement in the center of the table. Dad sat back slowly. Mark looked at him. What does it mean? The attorney opened the company's archived records beside my copy. 11 years ago, Bennett Industrial was carrying more debt than its lenders were comfortable with. Richard needed additional capital and couldn't obtain enough conventional financing on acceptable terms. He turned toward me. Lucy transferred $180,000 into the company. Mark rubbed a hand across his mouth. The attorney continued. Because that represented most of Lucy's inheritance, I advised both parties not to treat it as an informal family loan. He tapped Dad's signature. This agreement made Bennett Industrial responsible for repayment. It also secured the outstanding obligation against specified company assets. Mark stared at Dad. So she wasn't just helping you out. No, the attorney said. This was documented financing. The accountant pushed the repayment history across the table. The company made payments for several years, then they stopped. And the rest, Mark asked, still outstanding. Dad finally spoke. Lucy never pursued it. The attorney looked at him. That doesn't extinguish it. He went through the records one by one. There was no release bearing my signature, no document forgiving the balance, no accounting entry showing the obligation had been satisfied. Nothing. Mark leaned back. So can Dad give me the company or not? He can retire, the attorney said, and shares can be transferred subject to the governing agreements and existing obligations. What cannot happen is treating the company as though Lucy's secured rights simply don't exist. Some of the restructuring and asset transfer steps planned for the succession cannot proceed on that basis. That distinction mattered. The file didn't secretly make me the owner of Bennett Industrial. It did something far more believable. It proved the company still owed me for money I had actually put into keeping it alive, and that my rights were tied to assets Dad had planned around as though my claim had vanished. Mark turned to him. At dinner, when you saw the file, you asked her you kept that. Why? Dad stared at the tabletop. Richard, the attorney said. Dad exhaled. It had been 11 years. That isn't an answer, Mark said. Dad's eyes moved toward me. You changed offices. Records went into storage. You never pushed the issue. I assumed your copies were gone. There it was. Not a misunderstanding, an assumption. Dad had built his retirement plan around my silence. You thought I threw it away, I said. I thought we'd moved past it. No, you moved past it. Mark's face hardened. You were going to give me the company without telling me any of this. I was protecting the business. From what? Dad gestured toward me. From exactly this. I shook my head. This exists because you stopped honoring the agreement. Mark looked down. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. 12 years here and you're leaving with nothing. He couldn't look at me. That's what I said to you. Yes. I didn't know. You didn't ask either. He nodded once. I wasn't interested in humiliating him back. You believed Dad's version. He built everything. You inherited it. I was just the employee who stayed too long. Dad pushed his chair back. Lucy, what do you actually want? The agreement honored. You're willing to put lawyers between us over a family business. I looked at the signature on the page. You put lawyers between us 11 years ago because you needed my money badly enough to promise me protection in writing. You don't get to call that protection disloyal now because honoring it is inconvenient. Dad had nothing to say. The Monday succession was postponed. Over the following weeks, the accountant calculated the outstanding amount under the agreement. Paying everything immediately would have pulled too much working capital from Bennett Industrial. I had leverage, but I also knew what reckless use of it could do. I had spent 12 years keeping employees paid and suppliers working with us. I wasn't going to destroy the company just to make Dad suffer. I also wasn't forgiving the debt. So we negotiated. Part of the outstanding amount was paid from available company funds. For the remainder, I agreed to a restructuring that converted what I was owed into a meaningful ownership position with formal governance rights attached. Everything was documented this time. My authority would no longer depend on Dad saying, "Trust me." Mark stayed with the company, but the presidency Dad had handed him over dinner was no longer an unchecked inheritance. We moved to an interim leadership structure while responsibilities were formally divided. My 12 years running operations suddenly mattered in rooms where Dad had spent years treating them as expected family labor. The news traveled through the company quickly. Employees who had watched Dad order me to clear my desk learned that Monday's transition had been stopped. Dad's perfect retirement story was over. A few weeks later, Mark came into my office and closed the door. I owe you an apology. I waited. What I said at dinner was cruel. Yes, it was. I thought Dad had already settled everything with you. That still wouldn't have made it okay. He nodded. I know. I accepted the apology. I didn't pretend it repaired 12 years of favoritism in one conversation. If we're going to work together, I told him, what matters is what you do when Dad isn't standing between us. Mark agreed. Our relationship became professional before it became personal again. With Dad, the damage went deeper. Mark resented being handed a distorted version of the company he was supposed to inherit. I stopped asking Dad to acknowledge what I had contributed. He still retired. He simply didn't retire as the man who got to decide everyone else's future with one speech. Months later, I sat in the same office he had ordered me to clear. My name was still on the door, but now my position, authority, and financial interest were written into documents no one could erase with a retirement announcement. Mark worked alongside me under the new structure. Dad visited occasionally, but he no longer controlled our daily decisions. And the old file stayed in my bottom drawer. I didn't keep it because I expected another fight. I kept it because every time I saw that worn cover, I remembered what had taken me 12 years to understand. Loyalty and surrender were not the same thing. For years, I believed that if I worked hard enough and waited long enough, Dad would eventually recognize what I had done. In the end, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need a secret fortune. I didn't need some impossible loophole that suddenly made the whole company mine. I needed the one thing Dad had counted on me losing. Proof. Dad told me to clear my desk by Monday. Months later, I was still sitting behind it. Not because he changed his mind, but because I finally stopped letting his word decide what my 12 years were.